Before I left for parental leave, my manager put in writing, 8 weeks, my accounts held, nothing permanent unless it became necessary. I believed him. I had no reason not to. In week 2, a client emailed me by mistake. The message wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Priya Anand, Interim Director, Client Operations, my title on my account 6 weeks before my leave was even supposed to end. I told myself it was a mistake. Companies use words like interim loosely all the time. But interim titles don't usually show up in a staffing system 2 weeks after someone leaves, not if the plan really was temporary. So I asked myself the only question that mattered. If this was only supposed to happen if it became necessary, why did it already look finished? Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what I was walking away from and who I trusted to protect it. I'd spent 6 years building the client relationships that made up my book of business. I started as an account manager straight out of grad school, made director 3 years ago, and by the time I got pregnant with my second child, I had the kind of standing you don't get by accident. Clients call me directly instead of routing through a ticket system. My team ran well because I trained it to run well, not because it ran itself. And my manager, Mark Delaney, had sat across from senior leadership in more than one quarterly review and said, on the record, that I was the most dependable director on his roster. I believed him then. I had no reason not to. 8 weeks felt like a long time to be away during a renewal cycle that mattered to the whole department, and I told Mark as much when I put in for leave. Not because I doubted my standing, because I cared about the accounts, and I didn't want to come back to fires I could have prevented by planning better on the way out. Mark understood that instinct, or at least he acted like he did. 2 days before I left, he sent me a written coverage plan, CCNG, our HR business partner, laying out exactly how the handoff would work. My accounts would be temporarily held by Priya Anand, a senior account manager on my team who I'd personally mentored for 2 years. Nothing would be restructured. Nothing would become permanent unless something changed that made it necessary. And if that happened, he told me, he'd call me himself before anything moved. I read that email twice at my desk, thanked him in person, and let myself exhale for what felt like the first time in months. The Friday before I left, Mark pulled the team together for 15 minutes and told everyone, in front of Priya, that I'd be reachable only for real emergencies and that Priya would be the point of contact for day-to-day questions until I'm back. People clapped. Someone brought in a cake with a badly drawn stork on it. Priya hugged me and told me not to worry about a thing. And I believed her too, because I trained her myself and I trusted my own judgment about who I trained. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, piece by piece, was that Mark sent that plan the same week Daniel Reyes, our SVP of operations, had quietly asked him for staffing contingency options across the department, mine included. I have no way of knowing exactly what was in Mark's head when he wrote those reassurances to me. I only know the timing, and I know what came after it. My last week in the office, something small happened that I noticed and then talked myself out of noticing, the way you do when you're 3 days from leave and don't want to start a fight on your way out the door. IT provisioning sent out an access change confirmation, and through some mistake in the distribution list, I got copied on it by accident. It granted Priya full director-level system permissions, contract terms, budget lines, the reporting dashboards I used to run my part of the business, the same access I'd spent 3 years earning. A normal 2-month backfill doesn't need that. A backfill needs read access and a handful of specific permissions to keep the lights on while the actual owner is gone. This was the whole key ring, handed over before I'd even cleared out my desk. I remember sitting with that email open for a long time, thinking about how to raise it without sounding paranoid in my last 48 hours. Then I thought about how it would land, questioning IT's judgment over something that was probably just an overcautious default for covering a director-level role, whatever overcautious default was even supposed to mean in this case. So I closed the email, told myself it was probably nothing, and left for leave the next morning carrying a small, easy-to-ignore unease instead of the question I should have asked out loud. The unease didn't disappear. It just went quiet, the way things do when you're at home with a newborn who has never once cared about a staffing tracker. Then in week 2, the client email arrived, the one I told you about at the start. A vendor contact reached out about a contract renewal, and instead of addressing it to me, they addressed it to Priya Anand, Interim Director, Client Operations. A coworker who still had me on a group thread noticed it looked strange and forwarded it to my personal email with one line. "This looked off. Did they already replace you?" I read it standing in my kitchen, holding my daughter with one arm and my phone with the other. I read it again an hour later, after she was down for a nap, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming the second time. I told myself companies use interim loosely, that a vendor might have simply misheard a title on a call, that this didn't have to mean what it looked like it meant. But I couldn't shake the arithmetic. Week 2, not week 6, when Mark had said coverage would only escalate if needed. Week 2, when nothing about my accounts should have needed escalating at all. I didn't have an explanation that made the timing make sense. I just had a date that sat wrong in my chest, and 6 more weeks left to sit with it before I was scheduled to walk back in and find out I'd been right. I called a friend on the team that week, careful not to sound like I was fishing, and asked how things were going. She said things were fine, busy, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Priya had moved into the office next to Mark's, the one that had been sitting empty since a reorg the year before, the one directors used. I told myself an empty office is just an empty office. Someone has to sit in it. I said goodnight, put my phone face down on the counter, and lay awake anyway, doing the math on week 2 for longer than I want to admit. By week 4, I couldn't leave it alone anymore. I told myself I was just being thorough, the kind of director who checks in before a return, not the kind of person who panics from her kitchen table. I logged into our internal staffing tracker one evening after the baby was asleep, technically still on leave, and searched 2 names, mine and Priya's. Priya's record showed a formal title change, dated the same week as that vendor email. Not a placeholder flag, not a temporary coverage note. A change history entry showing her title updated outright to Interim Director, Client Operations, requested by HR Systems Administration on behalf of Daniel Reyes's office. That one word, requested, is what stopped me cold. Coverage plans don't get requested from an SVP's office. Staffing changes do. I sat there rereading the same 3 lines of a system log until they stopped looking like an accident and started looking like a decision that had already been made without me in the room to hear about it. I still didn't have proof of intent, only a timestamp and a job title. So I did what I spent 6 years training myself to do for a living. I went looking for the actual document that would tell me what the timestamp meant. A former colleague in operations planning still owed me a favor from a project we'd worked together 2 years earlier, and I asked her, carefully, if she could send me the current quarterly staffing deck. Nothing dramatic, just trying to stay current before I'm back. She sent it over without asking why, the way you do a small favor for someone you trust. My position was listed under a header that read redundant/consolidate, with a note underneath it in smaller print. Finalize post-leave to reduce disruption to client relationships. 2 slides later was an updated department org chart, the kind that usually only gets redrawn once a year at planning season. My box was gone. Priya's box sat exactly where mine used to sit, in my reporting line, with my old title beneath her name. It wasn't a draft or a placeholder version. It was labeled current, dated the same week as the tracker change. Whoever had built that slide hadn't been sketching out a possibility. They'd already redrawn the chart and filed it as fact. And in the approval field at the bottom of the deck, the name wasn't Mark's. It was Daniel Reyes's. I sat with that slide open for a long time, my laptop glowing in an otherwise dark kitchen. This had never been a coverage decision. Coverage decisions don't get filed under redundant. This was a headcount decision, made by a person I'd exchanged maybe a dozen sentences within 6 years of working there, and had already been signed and dated before I'd even finished my first month of leave. I went back to work at the end of week 8 the way you'd walk into a meeting you already knew was going to go badly, except I still didn't know exactly how badly. Mark met me in the hallway with what looked like real warmth, asked about the baby, told me my accounts had been temporarily consolidated for continuity while I settled back in, and said we'd sort out the details together that week. He didn't say interim director. He didn't say headcount. He reached for the softest available language, and I let him use it because I wanted to see how far the story would hold before I said out loud what I already knew. A few people on my team said hello like nothing had happened. A few others found reasons to be somewhere else, the way people do when they already know something you don't and would rather not be the one standing there when you find out. Priya wasn't in the empty office my friend had mentioned. She was in mine, at my desk, with a temporary nameplate that read interim director propped against my monitor. She looked as uncomfortable as I felt, which told me something too. Whatever this was, it hadn't been her idea, and she knew exactly how it looked. It didn't hold long. That afternoon, my badge failed at the door to the client strategy floor, the floor I'd worked on for 3 years, and I had to call down to security for an escort. I stood in that hallway holding a coffee I'd bought on the way in, waiting for someone to walk me onto a floor I used to have a corner office on, and I felt something shift from suspicion into certainty. When I asked Mark directly, that same evening, whether any of this was permanent, he told me he'd find out and circle back. He was my manager. He should have already known the answer without having to find anything out. The fact that he didn't or wouldn't say it was its own answer. I checked the access log that night from my laptop at home. My permissions had been formally downgraded the same week Priya's title changed in the system. The exact week Mark had emailed me from 3,000 miles of distance to say that nothing was changing. At that point, I stopped asking questions in hallways and started asking them in writing through channels that would leave their own record. I filed a formal request through HR's personnel and staffing access process, the legitimate route, not a confrontation, and asked for documentation related to my role during the leave period. The form itself asked me to state a reason. I wrote, clarifying role and access changes made during approved leave, which was true, procedural, and gave nobody a reason to slow walk it out of self-defense. I learned a long time ago that the fastest way to get a company to hand you a document is to ask for it the way the company itself would ask. It came back slower than I expected, and when it finally came, the most important thing in it wasn't the staffing deck I already had a copy of. It was the approval metadata sitting behind it. A restructuring of this size should have gone through a standard multi-sign-off process. My manager, an HR business partner, and at least one additional VP, each logging a formal review before anything moved. This one had a single signature on it, Reyes. No HR consultation was logged until 11 days after the decision itself was already dated final. Whatever this was, it hadn't gone through the process that exists specifically to keep a decision like this from happening quietly to one person while she wasn't in the building to ask a single question about it. That's when the last piece landed, and it's the one I still think about the most, more than the deck, more than the badge. I requested my own calendar export as part of the same records process, mostly out of habit, and cross-referenced the attendee list against Mark's meeting history, which HR could confirm without disclosing the meeting's contents. Mark had been an invitee at a leadership staffing review the same week the deck was finalized, the exact meeting referenced in the deck's own footnotes. I already knew he'd send me an email that week, the one that said, "Everything's fine here, don't worry about work, just focus on the baby." I hadn't thought twice about the timestamp on that email until I lined the two records up side by side. He sent it 4 hours after that meeting ended. He knew. Not vaguely, not since something was off from a distance. He sat in a room where my job was formally reclassified under someone else's name. And 4 hours later, he chose to write me a message engineered to make sure I didn't ask a single question while I still had time left to do anything about it. I want to be careful here because I don't think Mark is a villain in the way this might sound when I say it out loud. I think he was afraid of Reyes, of his own position on that org chart, of being the one who had to tell me the truth and watch what it did to the rest of my leave. But the fact that his fear made a kind of sense didn't make it feel any less like betrayal. He had the one piece of information that would have let me protect myself in real time, and he spent on making me feel calm instead. I laid everything out on my kitchen table one night after the kids were finally asleep. The coverage plan, the IT provisioning email, the client's misdirected message, the tracker change history, the staffing deck, the access log, the calendar cross-reference. Individually, each one had an innocent explanation I could talk myself into if I wanted one badly enough. A vendor mistake, an IT default setting, a manager trying to protect someone's feelings during a stressful stretch. But laid next to each other, in order, dated the way they were dated, they stopped being 7 separate accidents. They were one decision, made and started before I'd even boarded my flight home from the hospital with my daughter, executed in stages timed deliberately to a leave window, specifically because I wasn't there to interrupt any of it. I sat with a choice longer than I expected to. I could raise this quietly with HR, accept whatever correction they offered, and move on with as little friction as possible for everyone involved, including myself. That option was tempting for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness. It was faster, it was less exposed, and it meant I wouldn't have to sit across from Reyes or Mark while a review pulled apart 8 weeks I'd rather have just put behind me. But every time I reread my own timeline, the question I actually wanted answered got bigger, not smaller. Was this really only ever about me? Or had I just been the first person to notice? I requested a broader review, citing my own documentation as the basis for asking, and asked HR to check whether any other employee's leave had produced a similar pattern in recent department history. It had. 2 other managers, both on extended medical or parental leave within the previous 18 months, had interim titles finalized within 3 weeks of their absence beginning. And in both cases, the interim assignment had quietly become permanent by the time the original employee returned. 3 people, same mechanism, same narrow window. This had stopped being a story about whether Daniel Reyes made one questionable call regarding me specifically. It had become a story about whether this company had been using protected leave systematically as a scheduling tool for decisions it preferred not to defend while the person affected could still push back on it. I sat with the pattern data for a night before I did anything with it. 3 names, 3 leave windows, 3 interim titles that quietly stopped being interim. It was the kind of thing that's easy to see once and very hard to unsee afterward. I thought about the 2 people ahead of me who hadn't had a reason to go looking, or hadn't had the time, or hadn't wanted to spend their return from leave building a case instead of just being grateful to have a job to come back to. I didn't feel angry on their behalf so much as responsible. I was the one holding the piece that connected all 3. The formal review meeting was not dramatic, and I'm grateful it wasn't. Reyes opened by calling the whole thing standard continuity planning, handled a little early. That framing didn't survive 5 minutes once HR leadership had the pattern data laid out in front of them. 3 employees, 3 leave windows, 3 decisions finalized inside the first 3 weeks, all missing the sign-off process that exists precisely to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. The HR VP running the meeting asked Reyes directly why a restructuring of this scale had only 1 signature on it. He didn't have an answer that survived the question, so he stopped trying to answer it and asked instead what it would take to put this behind us quickly. That request is what told me the review had already tipped in a direction he didn't control anymore. Nobody raised their voice in that room. Nobody needed to. The documents did the part of the argument I used to think required confrontation. The company opened a formal review into the staffing decision affecting my role, and separately, a broader review of its leave transition practices across the department. Neither outcome was guaranteed the morning I walked into that meeting. I had done everything within my own control to do. What happened next belonged to them, not to me. What happened next was, by realistic workplace standards, about as close to accountability as these situations usually get. My title and my full account list were restored within 2 weeks, not gradually, not with conditions attached. The company adopted a formal policy requiring HR co-approval on any staffing change affecting an employee on protected leave, the exact structural gap that had let this happen 3 times without anyone above Reyes ever noticing, or asking a single question about why interim kept turning permanent so quickly. Reyes's authority to unilaterally approve staffing changes was reviewed and formally narrowed going forward. I don't know everything that happened to him after that meeting, and for the first time in months, I found I didn't need to know in order to feel like the record was finally accurate. The 2 other employees from the pattern review got quieter versions of the same outcome. One had already left the company for another job and received a formal acknowledgement and a settlement. The other was still there, and I made a point of telling her once that none of it had been in her head either. Priya kept her title as Senior Account Manager, with a formal note in her file clarifying that the interim director designation had been assigned without her request and outside normal process. She hadn't built any of this. She'd just been standing in the spot they needed someone standing in. Mark and I had one honest conversation weeks later, away from the office, over coffee neither of us really drank. He admitted he'd known before I ever came back, that he'd chosen not to tell me because he was afraid of what it would cost him if he pushed back on Reyes directly, on someone else's behalf, with his own position still unsettled. I believe that was true. I don't think he set out to hurt me on purpose. I also don't think being afraid is the same thing as being innocent, and I told him that once, calmly, and then I let it go because carrying it any further wasn't going to hand me back anything I actually needed. I didn't imagine what I felt walking back onto that floor and finding a job that looked identical from the outside and wasn't the same job at all underneath. For 8 weeks I was told, gently and repeatedly, that I was wrong to notice what I was noticing. I wasn't wrong. The chart really had been redrawn before I was even 6 weeks into an 8-week leave, and every reassurance I got in between was true only in the narrowest, most technical sense. I was just early, and I had the patience to wait for the paperwork to catch up to what I already understood before anyone would say it out loud. In the end, it wasn't confrontation that changed anything. It was documentation, kept quietly and in order until it couldn't be argued with anymore. If you've ever come back from leave to a job that looked the same on the surface but felt quietly rearranged underneath you, I'd like to know, did you go looking for the paper trail right away, or did it take you a while to trust what you were already seeing? If stories like this one feel familiar to you, you're welcome here at Copper Note.